Yeah, that's not a picture of me in 24.
Well, everybody got quiet, so might as well start. Welcome, everybody. Glad to have you here at the Noon Debrief. I'm Brad Worthen. Our speaker today, Moss Blachman, has had a long and varied career in and around the academic world and beyond. When I first met him more than 30 years ago, we were just talking about trying to figure out exactly when it was. It was early 90s, I think. He was teaching political science with an emphasis on Latin America. I walked into his office in Gambrell over at USC one day, and high on the wall behind his desk was a map of the Western Hemisphere, except it was upside down compared to most maps. South America at the top, North America at the bottom. Since I had spent a very large chunk of my childhood living in South America and had always been disappointed by how my fellow Americans tended to ignore everything south of Miami, I was delighted to see that. Over the years, we got to be friends and got together for lunch now and then. Moss would always come to the table wearing a suit and tie, and on his lapel he would always be wearing a tiny bronze star pin, which he's wearing today. Moss was proud of his service and is proud of his service. So I recently asked him to tell me about it because I didn't know, what he did. And now I've asked him to come tell you because I thought it was very interesting. So here he is to speak about the time when he was an Air Force intelligence officer in Vietnam in 1965 to 66. Please join me in welcoming Moss Blachman.
Thank you, everybody, and I appreciate your coming. It's kind of a new stage for me, having finally retired, sort of. I tell people I never retire, I retread. And the movement into and thinking about what I'm going to be doing in this next phase of my life, and part of it, frankly, is writing a kind of memoir. And so this kicked it off to get me to start thinking about what I'm doing. And I thought there'd be some things I'd like to share with you. Some of it has to do with the techniques and things I did as an intelligence officer. And some of it I thought maybe sharing just about the Vietnam experience. And it may or may not be similar to some of you who obviously were in Vietnam as well. I was there very early. I went to Vietnam at the very beginning of October of 1965, and I was there through August of 66. So it was just under a year, and an extraordinary experience. I was a volunteer, and I knew that because the U.S. government told me so. And that's, in fact, all of us were volunteers when we went. And we were all, the term we used in the military was we were voluntold. And that sort of met it. When I went over, we were somewhere around 15,000, 18,000 troops. When I left, we were around 150,000. And one of the things that I remember was I'd already been in the service about 3 years or so, and 3.5 years, and I thought I had some idea of things, but I had not seen any kind of combat. I'd been in all kinds of operations in the United States in prep for Vietnam, though I did not know until later that that's what I was in prep for. That's the kind of thing hindsight is 20/20, as they say. And I had, in all honesty, some pretty romantic notions about what it meant to be in the military. It's funny, we're in the Confederate relic room. Well, I'm a Southerner, and we grew up with these ideas that an officer and a gentleman and that kind of thing, and the romance of war, even though, if you look at war, there's nothing very romantic about people being slaughtered. And I had that until our plane was over Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon. It had been a very long trip from the United States. Those of you here who are in the military can appreciate some of this in particular. Absolutely nothing went as planned. Nothing. The term in the military is snafu. Situation normal, all effed up. And that was very standard. So we took off from Travis Air Force Base in San Francisco. Oh, wait a minute. No, we didn't take off. No, we were scheduled to take off. We were there for over 24 hours waiting to get on the plane, getting on a plane, getting off the plane, and so on. We stopped in Hawaii because there were some problems with the plane. And we used to joke that it was, thank God for the South, because we had duct tape and some baling wire to fix it. And then we got into Saigon. I've been on a lot of planes, but I hadn't been on one that made a landing like this. And although we were not really shot at, there were tracers going off around us. And when we got in, and I just thought this would be kind of fun to share. So I've been now close to 40 hours or so with no sleep, flying in, wondering what's going on. All of a sudden the plane's going like this. We see these tracers go off, and we land, and they take us in for a briefing. And we get in the briefing, and in the briefing room they tell us, well, let's see, they separate the officers from the enlisted, and they tell us, the officers, that we are premium, that the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, really would love to have officers. And so we need to be especially careful. And then they told us that Air Force is premium over the others. Whether any of this is true is another story. And that intelligence officers in particular were ones that they really wanted to get a hold of. And then they said, by the way, the bachelor officers' quarters for you to stay in are full. And we don't have any place to put you, so we're going to have to take you into town and try and find a place. There is a quarters we can put you in for a very short period of time, and then you're going to be on your own. Oh, and by the way, the pickup truck we're going to put you in, be careful, because last week somebody came up in what in essence was a motorcycle and tossed a grenade in, so you want to be careful as you're going. And if you go to a bar, be careful to check the ice, because sometimes they put shaved glass in instead of ice. Have a good evening, get ready tomorrow, and then we'll start the real briefings. 48 hours close to no sleep, and this is my introduction, and I'm thinking, I heard wars were nuts, but this was a little much. But it really didn't have a significantly negative impact on me, as much as something that happened shortly after that, and I mean very shortly after that. The U.S. government's 1st Cavalry was in the Ia Drang Valley. This was the first really big battle that was a disaster in the war, and it was a massacre. And I mean a massacre. We lost several hundred Americans, and Tan Son Nhut was the base where when people died, they were brought, put in a body bag. The body bag was put in essentially a cooler because it was hot as hell in Vietnam, and you can imagine being in this, having a body decompose is not very nice. So they didn't have room because they had not anticipated these kinds of losses. So these body bags were there on the tarmac in the heat, and the stench around the base was incredible. I still remember it. Between those little things, all the romanticism about war went right out the window. And I can tell you, it never came back. There's nothing romantic about killing, maiming people, seeing people die, be harmed. And that can be in many ways, and we know out of Vietnam, for an awful lot of it, the whole notion of PTSD, the kind of traumatic responses that people had. So I wanted to mention that as a sort of setup because you're there. And by the way, the stance is, if something's going to happen to me, please let it happen soon, because I don't want to go through all of this and then have it happen the day before or a week before I'm coming home. So that's to give you a kind of context in which a lot of what life was like in those early days. And we were still fairly new. The United States had not fully declared what we were doing. President Johnson had stated as early as March of '65 that we may go in. But my assignment, actually, I received my assignment in January of '65 to report in October. And that came out of the Pentagon to Tactical Air Command somewhere in late November, early December of '64, which meant that the panel that picked me, as well as others like me, actually met in early November '64. So we were being told lots of things, but in fact, that's part of the reality, is all this was in planning by the US government long before anything was said to the American public. So in March of '65, that's now 5-6 months after my assignment had actually been developed, the President of the United States announced that we were thinking about doing some things and didn't do it. So, so let me just mention now something about intelligence operations and work and what might be helpful or meaningful, because I'm going to talk about a lot of things that unfortunately were not nice and good. But I also wanted to mention in the beginning the incredible importance of intelligence and sharing. I mentioned to you the Ia Drang Valley Massacre. But here's something else, and I don't have absolute proof on this, so I just want to share with you the story and see what you think. I was an avid reader of current events even before I went to Vietnam, and I had read a book by a guy by the name of Wilfred Burchett called Vietnam, the Inside Story of the Guerrilla War. It was published about 2 or 3 months before I actually had to report. And as I got there, because I had access to the intelligence reports on a regular basis, what I found was happening was that we would send out our troops on patrol, and the Viet Cong would come. There was a particular technique they used at the back and in the front to distract our troops and then pick us off one at a time. This was in the Army. And I was a little surprised because I found the Air Force was not overly interested in helping the Army or the Navy, but then I learned the Army wasn't interested in helping the Navy, the Air Force, and the Navy wasn't interested. I mean, a lot of that didn't happen. But I was able to bring this to the attention of some colleagues of mine who were in Army intelligence to help them and tell them that if they wanted to see this, the techniques were actually published in a book they could look at and they could revise how they were doing things. And it was that kind of sharing it at times that was extremely important, and being able to know how you can use the intelligence information in an effective manner. There were other times when things happened, and I'll tell you again, I want to go back to this snafu because I think a lot of that's there as well. We were sharing information with the Navy, and in those days the Navy had a certain area where they were able to bomb, and they were responsible for what was happening. Mostly it was out country, that is in North Vietnam. It was outside of South Vietnam. And there was a big fight in the American Congress in those days over the Army, Air Force, and Navy. The Army was increasing its air arm. They argued they had to have this in order to provide the kind of support they needed for their troops. The Navy was increasing its air arm out of the ships And they argued it was necessary to protect the ships and be able to do what they needed to do, especially with the Marines. And the Air Force was scared that it was going to lose what it was. The Air Force only became a separate force in the Second World War or afterwards. So it was very interested in making sure none of that happened. So what they did is at one point in the process, they asked the Navy where they were going with some stuff. They weren't satisfied with how it happened, and they simply sent a directive to me and some others, not just personally to me, but as an intelligence officer, telling us that we should no longer report certain kinds of material and information. They took a certain kind of report that we were putting out on a daily basis, and they say, don't do that anymore. And I can remember having a conversation with my superior officers saying, I don't understand. If we find a surface-to-air missile site, this is a surface-to-air missile site, if we find a surface-to-air missile site, don't we care if Navy pilots get shot down, or do we only care if Air Force pilots get shot down? And I was told that that wasn't the issue, that as a lieutenant, I should keep my mouth shut and do what I was told. And so what I did was I kept the Navy on it anyway, because I believed that that was really critical. Obviously, I ended up not getting in trouble because I could have been in a lot of trouble at the time. But part of it is how critical it is for people to know things. This is a picture of a surface-to-air missile site that Brad found. It's sort of stock, and you can see how clear it is, and they know where everything is, and you can see all these things, and it's labeled. How do we get to this next one?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. You probably can't see much on this, but this is a lot more like what the photography looked like that I was looking at. That was a satellite picture that they put out, which it makes everybody happy to know how brilliant we all are. This is the stuff that we worked with. And I worked on a table that had raw film on it. And we had this little gizmo right here. That's it. So you can see the distance my head was over a light table, and this was the people who worked with me. I did a certain amount of it. Mostly it was others who were working for me who were doing this. And you stared into extremely bright light with negative film going across, checking it, trying to find where's the missile, what's going on here, what really is the issue. And that's another one where these pictures, and I realize you can't see much or tell much about it. That looks like an airplane, but it's actually part of a surface-to-air missile. This is an actual shot of a surface-to-air missile taking off. When I shared this with Brad, he asked me if that was being shot at the pilot that was taking the picture, and my answer is probably not. But every mission, or nearly every mission around the time that I was there, was actually made up of what we call four sorties, which were 4 different folks who flew, so there were 4 planes in formation. So this would have been shooting at one of the others, because what they would normally do is kind of aim in or get a sense of as the first plane went through to do the bombing or whatever it was doing. And by the time you got to the 3rd or 4th, they were on and would send the missile out. And then we would work with it. And this is a shot later on when we bombed the oil refineries in North Vietnam in Haiphong, and I'll come back to that. And that's a composite picture that somebody was coming through on the Boston Globe and took pictures of a lot of us. And how I ended up in the Boston Globe, or for whatever reason, I have no idea, but that was done. So thought it might be just kind of fun to show some of those. But I think particularly what's important is to understand that we were looking at multiple forms of intelligence. We had reports that came in from the Army, from the Air Force, from the Navy. We had imagery that was taken. Presumably, a lot of the imagery was good. It included radar photos, a little bit of infrared, not much. Infrared is important to give you an idea of what you can do with that. So you read a lot now about the tunnels in Gaza and how Hamas is using the tunnels. Well, the Vietnamese, the Viet Cong, dug tunnels. Theirs were not the sophisticated poured concrete type. They were just dug in the ground, but they set things up. And one of the things that we could do with infrared is we could see the signatures of where there was heat. So that we could identify where entrances were. They learned to adjust to that, by the way. They were very good at adjusting to things. But intelligence was very good to be able to do that. We also did a tremendous amount of target selection and then bomb damage assessment afterwards. And sometimes this came up with results that people didn't particularly want. For example, one of the things that was happening was that there were reports of a lot of damage, and I think Brad put this in the PR that came out, that, and it reflects an article I wrote shortly after I got out of the military called "The Stupidity of Intelligence." And really what it was about, the stupidity was not the intelligence information. It was the way the intelligence information was used, particularly by policy people. The information that came out of intelligence was very good, but how it was used or misused was another issue. So the way that worked, for example, was we would have, let's say you had a convoy of 9 vehicles. The first pilot flies in, drops their bombs. There's tremendous mess up in the air. This person's flying at least 600 miles an hour, if not faster, looks back as trying to get out, get up, and make sure they're not shot down by a surface-to-air missile. And said, I saw what looked like 3 trucks destroyed and 2 damaged, et cetera, and moves on. The second pilot is coming in for their drop, the third pilot, the fourth pilot, and when things come back and the debrief takes place, you've got 4 pilot reports. It was not unusual to find that if you added those 4 pilot reports together, instead of understanding what they were, that you had more trucks destroyed and damaged than you had in the convoy. In fact, and it's one of the things I put in my article, we were bombing 1 or 2 special bridges, and those of you who are there may recall the Thanhua Bridge, which was a major bridge. And I remember I found a diary I had kept occasionally, and I was writing in my diary, what in God's name do people back in the States think that we keep bombing this bridge? You know, it's like and I'm gonna just, these are not the accurate numbers, let's say a 10-span bridge. And every day for weeks, we report that 1 or 2 or 3 spans are damaged or destroyed. And I thought to myself, do people in the United States think that the Vietnamese are so brilliant that they can repair spans overnight and that their bridges stay up? What's going on? How does somebody not question this? And I couldn't understand it. But at the policy level, it made a huge difference, and I'll tell you why, and it's one of the reasons why I showed you that picture of the plume of smoke. Our own Strom Thurmond argued in Congress that we had an inventory at the beginning of the war of about 9,000 vehicles, and at the point that he was talking, they still had around 9,000 vehicles. Well, and we also showed that there had been, if you added all these pilot reports, 6,000 to 7,000 vehicles that had been destroyed. Obviously, if that's the case, all these vehicles have been replaced. And there are only 2 ways that could happen. Coming in from China, across the border in very rugged territory. No way you could bring them in without being able to be seen by the imagery that we were taking, because we were watching that very carefully. Or they were sort of slipping into the port at Haiphong. Now, how they think that could have happened without us seeing it, I don't know, because we had coverage of it all the time and we were looking at it all the time. But nonetheless, that was the argument, and so we had to stop them from doing that. Now, that's not the only argument, but it was one of the key arguments. And the truth is, they had them because when we had the raw intelligence, when we flew over through the reconnaissance pilots, anybody in here fly recce, reconnaissance? Our pilots went over, took the photos, we then looked at it, and you might find one truck was damaged. What would happen is a lot of the ground is kind of like sand. Imagine if you dropped a grenade or something at the beach. You know, you'd get a lot of sand blowing up in the air. That doesn't stop people from doing things. In fact, one of the big efforts that had taken place that I found particularly interesting was we had a recommendation to use B-52 bombers to take a pass through the Mugia Pass, for those of you who are around. It's outside, actually technically it was not in Vietnamese territory. We, by the way, redefined the border 15 miles. We just simply said, we're gonna pretend the border's 15 miles and our troops can pursue people in that area, and we're gonna work with it. But the idea was, all this resupply is taking place in South Vietnam. We need to find a way to stop it. So how are we gonna find a way to stop it? And there was a colonel, a full colonel in the Air Force, who said, we can't do this with these sort of tactical kinds of things. We really need to get the B-52s in there with the big bombs. And what we need to do is catch these people on the way down. Now, let me do a spoiler alert here. We were talking about this just before we started this session. In many cases, the mortars and resupply that were taking place inside South Vietnam actually were Vietnamese who would walk from North Vietnam into South Vietnam carrying 2 mortars on their back and what was called gruel. It was a kind of a plastic casing that had the food they needed that went from here to here. That's not exactly the kind of thing that big bombing campaigns work very well on. And in fact, the first night we did the B-52 bombing, man, you can't imagine these big bombs, how much sand and things they throw up. But when we sent the reconnaissance plane in afterwards, what we found were tracks right through the holes that had been created. It did not stop them, it just made it a little more inconvenient for the trucks that were going through. I can tell you that, and this is a true story, I was in the briefing area to brief the general on the fact that it had not worked. And I was met by a full colonel, the one I mentioned, who had come up with the idea. And he was extremely upset because he had put his whole career on the line arguing why this would be the case. And he told me, and this is a true story, he told me, Lieutenant, if you show up for this briefing and you give this briefing, you will get a helicopter ride. Anybody know what a helicopter ride was in Vietnam? A helicopter ride was something that was done on occasion, not something fun, particularly done with South Vietnamese troops that were considered not to be loyal or who had engaged in some fraction. They would put their hands behind their back, tie their thumbs together, take them up over their unit, and at about 300 feet push them out. And I made the calculus that night. I'm not going in there to a briefing. And I did that because I knew the photos were going in there. The briefing was going to take place, whether I personally did it or not, it didn't matter. But I mention that because there were a lot of pressures that people were under. This is not necessarily a guy who had a reputation for being a bad guy, but who was very committed to this and very worried about it. So there were lots of things that happened, and the intelligence information was critically important. Let me give you another example, though, of how things went awry. So I was in one of the 6 a.m. briefings with the general, and the general said, you know, I don't recall that we've come up with any new targets in the last several days. It looks to me like we're still doing the same kind of things. Why? What's going on? Are there no new targets for us to bomb? Well, I went back to my squadron, which was about a distance from this wall to that wall from where the 7th Air Force headquarters was. And in the briefing, in addition to me, was another member of our squadron who was more senior than me, and he reported to the lieutenant colonel, who was the commander. And so the lieutenant commander said, well, if that's the case, then what we need is we need to make sure that we turn in new targets for tomorrow. And those of you who served in the military know that when a very senior officer makes a statement like that, that's considered a command, whether you want to or not. And therefore, between the lieutenant colonel, the major, the 2 captains, and then getting back down to me as a lieutenant, we were told to report somewhere between 15 and 25 new targets. And we were told this as an order, not some new targets. So we had aerial photography come in, we took a good look at it, and the truth was there was nothing in it. So about 1 o'clock in the morning, and these days I was usually working around 16, 18 hours. That was pretty typical. There were even occasions where you'd work 22 hours and the only time you had off wasn't worth sleeping, so you'd just go get something to eat and start all over. I went to the officers' mess, the place to get some food, just to get some food, and I was gone about an hour and a half or so. I come back and I find my tech sergeant, who's a very senior person, had been around a long time, is literally visibly shaking. So I asked him, what's the problem? And he said that a captain who I had had a lot of run-ins with, who was my superior, had come in while I was gone and had asked him about how many targets we were submitting. And he told the captain, none. And the captain said, why? And he said, because there weren't any. Seems like a pretty good reason. And then Captain Irwin said, I want to see the film. Put it on the table. So they put it on the table, and they went scrolling through, and they find, and you can see the brilliant imagery, how clear this was. Up comes a village. And he points at it and he says, what's that? And the tech sergeant said, that's a village, sir. And he said, a suspect military storage area, don't you think? And then another village, suspect military supply area, don't you think? And several things like this. And again, keep in mind that when your superior officer is talking like that, that then is taken as an order. It's not simply, what do you think? That's not what do you think means. What do you think means you will do this and I want it there, because he had also been talking about how important it was for us to have the new targets for the general that morning. So I come back and this tech sergeant is literally shaking. And I ask him why, and he tells me the story. And this is something Brad had put in his blog, but it's something I'm very proud of, although at the time it was kind of scary. And I turned to him and I said to him, I am your superior officer. I am giving you a direct order. Do not submit a single one. We are not going to do this. We know this is a village. We know this is not military storage or supply. We are not going to do this just because of the fact that that's desired. And I brought the whole team in and I said, I want you all to witness this. I will take full responsibility, and I did. The interesting thing is the captain never said a word to me about this, never. And I mention it because by and large, this shows two things. One, there were rogue folks who were so interested in their careers that they didn't care what collateral damage they brought to anybody. And my experience was the overwhelming majority of the people I work with were people with integrity, decency, and caring. And I think that's often not the view out there about the military. I have enormous faith and trust in the military as a result of my 4.5 years in my time in Vietnam, because I think it worked out well. But those dangers are there, and finding ways to make sure always that those kinds of things don't happen are really important. Now I'd like to share a quick story, and then I'm going to give you some time to ask some questions, and I've got a couple of other stories here. I hope you don't mind that this is a kind of stream of consciousness of stories, but I thought that was sort of a way to present a lot of this. I told you that there was a kind of quasi-war going on between the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy. So I'm in the squadron one night. Don't remember exactly what time. It was 2 or 3 in the morning. And I get a call, literally, and I am told to get in a Jeep in front of my building. I'm not told where I'm going. I'm not told what it's about. I'm just told, be there. My commander is told that I'm gone. He has nothing to do with anything. The reason for this in part is I had a number of kind of esoteric clearances. And I had access to lots of things that people just generally didn't have. So I'm in the Jeep, I don't know where I'm going, and we're flying in the dark out down toward the very end of Tan Son Nhut Air Base in a very secluded area. And all of a sudden, an F-4, 104 comes landing. They brought one other person with me. We developed the film, and they tell me, my job is to look at this film and to find information that proves that the Navy was not doing its bombing job in North Vietnam. Now, I tried to tell my superior officers at that point that that would be like demonstrating there's no unicorn. There was no way you could look and show that they didn't do it. You could look and show they did do it, but you couldn't look and show they didn't do it, because we didn't have anything that they were supposed to be doing. If we didn't know what they were supposed to do, there was no way to show they didn't do it. So looking at the film was not going to bring this about. It was a super secret thing. We sent an Air Force pilot into the air in North Vietnam without alerting the Navy, without the capacity or the information for something called IFF, Identify Friend or Foe. That's an electronic system that allows, if we have pilots in the air from different units and so on, it automatically lets you know that's a friendly guy, you don't shoot him down. And remember, the reconnaissance pilots, they're not armed. So had he been discovered, he would have been shot down probably. And I mention that because that's one of the areas where the foolishness about how you use intelligence can play out. And so my experience was all of these things kind of played in. But actually, there's one more thing I want to tell you, which is kind of a story that illustrates another piece of some of the lessons that I learned. I had decided near the end of my tour that I was going to go back to school. I was going to finish an MA. I'd already been coming over from Shaw Air Force Base before I went to Vietnam and taking courses at USC in international studies. We had a phenomenal program here. And I decided I wanted to come back, get a master's, and I thought go on for a PhD. My initial commitment was 4 years. Now, what I didn't know at the time, those of you in the military will just laugh at me, but what I didn't know at the time is, first, when I entered the military, that's not when the 4 years started. I entered and went through officer training school, so the 3 months of officer training school didn't count to the 4 years. So it was after I graduated that. So that meant 4 years, 3 months, etc. And then what I learned was when you got assigned to something like Vietnam, you were required to accept a 1 year, and you could not get out prior to the 1 year. Once I learned that and I knew it was there, even before I went, I volunteered to go early so that I could get out sort of close to my separation, which would have been June of '66 under those new numbers. But of course, the military didn't need me before that, right? I mean, everything was the date you're going to have there. So I initiated a number of requests through the Air Force and through proper channels, asking to be released 25 days roughly early so that I could go to school. I'd been accepted to come back here and finish my master's degree. It went through all kinds of stuff. I won't go through all of that. But the bottom line is they came back and said no. And so I ended up meeting with the Inspector General, or a representative of the Inspector General's office. And I asked him why. Because I had been endorsed by everybody, including the Major General at 7th Air Force. All of them endorsed for me to get this, and they turned it down. And he said, you have a critical skill and you have special qualifications. We cannot possibly let you go. You have to be there. So I turned to him and I said, I don't understand. If I'm that important, how is it a month later it's okay for me to leave? At which point he said, Lieutenant, I suggest you not open your mouth and say another word. Any trouble? And I said, yes, sir. Now, why do I tell this story? Obviously, I made it. I actually ended up getting out in the end of August. How did that happen? Well, I didn't know how it happened until after I'd gotten back. Because all of a sudden, in August, in the beginning of August of 1966, I received orders telling me that I was to return at the end of August. And I thought, oh my God, did something change? So I went to find out, and here's, there's an issue. You don't want to ask too many questions because I don't want anybody to say to me, all right, we made a mistake, sorry, you have to stay till October. But I was sort of discreetly checking around and so on, and I couldn't get any kind of answer. And I honestly did not learn about this until afterwards. What happened was we had an airman who was in charge of personnel in our squadron. And the way the system worked in those days was this person was responsible for when everybody would leave. And he, every month, put out a log that listed all the people who were to be put on a flight to go back home. He thought it was extremely unfair, all that. He knew all the paperwork because he was in personnel, and he thought it was extremely unfair what had been done to me. So he just flat out put me on it early. Nobody said a word, and I'm here. And had it not been for him, I don't know what my life would have been like, because I would have not been able to come back here for graduate school and so on. And one of the lessons I learned out of that, which I had already believed, is never underestimate or demean anybody. Every single person is somebody who can provide help and so on. And it's a two-way street. It's not just what you can get from them, it's what you can provide. I had a really good relationship with this airman and had worked with him on a number of things over the years. I never said a word to him about it, and I didn't know until I got back. So I've tried to share kind of a range of things. I'd love to hear any questions or comments that you have, anything that I can answer. I could obviously go on with stories for the next 3 weeks, but so please, if you've got any thoughts. Yes, ma'am.
I'd love to know about your background, your earlier background.
My earlier background. I grew up in Portsmouth, Virginia, which is, saying you're from Portsmouth, Virginia for most people is like saying you're from Casey instead of Columbia. It's actually next to Norfolk. We used to resent that a lot because the Norfolk Naval Shipyard is actually in Portsmouth, and the Norfolk Naval Hospital is in Portsmouth, but because there were naval bases in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, we couldn't have ours named Portsmouth. So I grew up there, and I went through high school. I was like a lot of people. I had a very poor Southern education, I hate to say. Had not learned an awful lot. Through a series of weird events, I ended up going to college at Brandeis University outside of Boston, which was an incredible experience, positive experience, very difficult, but very positive. I had always planned, before that, my initial plan was to go to the University of Virginia Law School, come home, practice, hopefully make some money, and run for the US Senate. That's what I thought I was gonna do if you'd talked to me when I was in high school. I went to Brandeis. I went over to some classes at Harvard in law and found it very disappointing because I didn't think it showed anything to do with justice. It was all about winning, and I didn't find that very inspiring, and decided I needed to have some time. So I came back home and taught in my own high school. And the world was in a lot of turmoil in this was 61, the fall of 61 and the spring of 62. And I had been told that I was going to be drafted. Like a lot of college graduates or college folks, I hadn't even been assigned anything. I wasn't released from the draft. I'd never even been considered for it. And I remember having a conversation, and they said, the choice is between you and the football coach. And so you're going to be the one. Well, I started looking around, and I won't go into all the details, but I ended up, the Air Force offered me the opportunity to go to officers training school, do that in that 12 weeks, be in the intelligence field. My eyes didn't allow me to be a pilot. I decided I didn't want to be a navigator. And I would be sent, and again, those of you in the military appreciate this, 12 weeks training in Denver, and then either Wiesbaden or Rhein-Main Air Base in Germany, or Yokota in Japan. That sounded pretty good. And I had just recently gotten married, and I was thinking, you know, I don't want to be in a different position, so I ended up accepting it. Now, 2 weeks before we graduated from officer training school, they came and said, all of you folks who are in intelligence, sorry, you're not going to Denver. You're going to go to the glorious place called Wichita Falls, Texas. And you're not going to be there for 12 weeks, you're going to be there for 31. They jokingly say at Wichita Falls, it's the only place in the world where you can be in the mud up to your neck and have the dust blow in your face. And that's probably an understatement. And so, you know, we did that. And then out of there, I got what was called the second best assignment of my cohort of about 20 some people, and that was Shaw Air Force Base. And while I was at Shaw, I would come over to take some courses at the university. So does that give you enough?
Thank you.
Sure. Comments, questions? Yes, sir.
A couple of funny stories about when I was in Vietnam. I was there 66, 67. And I worked in I had a top secret clearance job, and walked past the mortuary every day,
Yeah, boy, that
burning the clothes from the soldiers that were killed, which is how I ended up with Agent Orange, even though I was in the Air Force. And I volunteered to clear flares out of the helicopters for the Army. Next day, the police came and said, you can't do it. I said, why? I said, because you have a top secret clearance and you can't fly anything but a fixed wing aircraft, 2 engines or more. So, you know, that was kind of shaped my life after that.
Well, it's interesting. I got orders to go in an aircraft very similar to the one that you flew in. We were talking before. And what they wanted was, they thought it would be better if I could be in the nose of an airplane, and while we were taking the imagery, also to be able to look at it in real time and call people in. And I couldn't go because I had all these clearances I'm glad, frankly, you know, but that was a similar kind of thing.
Yeah.
There was deception. We were told. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No,
I'm right here.
Oh, right here. Yes, ma'am.
Go ahead.
With your background in intelligence and, knowing what you know, why did we lose this war? We were so superior with material, and I know that our military is an excellent military. They're out there to do the job. Was it political will?
Well, we were talking about this. There are a lot of things, I think, that explain it. A lot of these are things that I didn't know when I was there. When I did my PhD, I ended up doing a lot of research on this because I wanted to understand a lot of this myself. During the Second World War, the Allied forces promised Ho Chi Minh that if he would join the Allies, that they would guarantee him a certain kind of autonomy in that area, and the French would not keep them as colonies and so on. When the war was over, the French said, maybe we've changed our mind. We really want our colonies back in Indochina and so on. And he and others felt very much betrayed, and they were sort of pushed aside, shunted as, you're not going to be able to do anything. And that's part of what led to the decision to move in the direction that they moved in. We talked in those days about hearts and minds of people. That's became more clear in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan afterwards. There was a tremendous amount of corruption in the government in South Vietnam. Both Key and the two kind of leaders were involved. Folks themselves were not committed. We were talking about something called the Chu Hoi program, which was a program where we allowed people who were in the Viet Cong to come in, and there were some who sincerely did that. We were talking before about a particular grouping that gave up as a group. But a lot of that was managed in some weird ways. The Americans didn't always distinguish themselves, and we engaged in a lot of fighting that was very vicious. We presumed where people were. We didn't know. We didn't understand a lot of the harm that we were creating. It wasn't intentional always. And on top of that, there was not a clear sense of mission on the part of most of the American fighting people who were in the war. I wasn't in World War II, but it seems to me pretty clear that people in World War II knew, and you were on one side or another side, and I mean, I'm sure there were a few people, whatever, but there wasn't any question. You were with the Axis or the Allies, and that was it. Here, there was a lot of questions, and you may recall during that period that we lost a lot of people, our own people who were, the term was fragged. Our own people shot and killed some of our own people. I left just as marijuana was wafting through the air at a level that was sort of unbelievable to me. But our troops were in a very different kind of world. So we thought we were heroes. We were in a view of world communism. That wasn't the view they had. There were people who wanted to protect their own things, but there just wasn't the kind of support. And the longer we were there and the more damaged, the more convinced, particularly the North Vietnamese and many in the South, just wanted it to end and wanted to get together. None of this was pretty. And I think one of the sad things was the Tet Offensive showed that there was a lot more power and ability there than we ever anticipated. And frankly, we never fought the war like we were fighting a real war. I mean, this kind of small stuff that I've mentioned about the conflict between the Air Force and the Army and the Navy was stuff that I had experienced in exercises in the United States before I went. I had no idea where they were going, like I said. But we didn't have a united understanding of this at all. It was just very, very sad. And then the American public didn't support it. I mean, you know, you have these apocryphal stories. When I got home, I got on a plane not too long after I was home, and there was a woman sitting next to me, and we were talking, and when it came up, I don't know, maybe 5 minutes into the conversation that I'd been in Vietnam, she just gave me a horrible look and turned, and that was the end, and no more conversation. You know, I mean, that kind of thing. So there wasn't support here. It was just a cluster all the way around. Yes.
We know that there was deception with regard to losses, North Vietnamese losses and so forth. But we were told.
Yeah, it was a body count war,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the body count was absolutely false.
Did you have direct experience with
Yes.
that? Okay.
I had direct experience in that I saw cables at a level of coming from McNamara specifically to Westmoreland, asking about the casualties and reports on it, and I saw the answers go back, and I knew they weren't true. What I didn't know was whether or not that was collusion in Washington for political purposes, and I still don't know the answer to that. But I knew a lot of the reporting was false. Now, and I was there in the very beginning, so you know, by the time most of the rest of the folks here who were there, it was different. And the reporting, and that's another thing. I didn't mention this, but just real quickly, there was a hotel in downtown Saigon called Continental. It was sort of the meeting place, and they had this incredible roof garden. And on occasion, if you could, to get up there and just sit and do things, you know, talk or whatever, was really wonderful. So on occasion, when I had a chance, I would do it. One of the things that I found absolutely incredible was you would see journalists from American newspapers, major newspapers, sitting there with what are called MACV. MACV was the military command out of Vietnam. Their reports, which every person there knew were not honest. And they would say, they would be writing their report while they were drinking a gin and tonic. There I was in An Key when so-and-so, or there I was, you know, in Da Nang when blah, 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 blah. Absolute lies. There were very few journalists that I met when I was there who had the integrity to write what was true. There was a journalist by the name of R.W. Apple for the New York Times, and he might have been one of the best and most accurate. I would see these papers like, you know, 10, 15 days late, but they were about things that I knew, so I would see what was written. But that wasn't there. But there's also another thing that's kind of interesting about being at the Continental, and I reflected on this. I would sit there sometimes, and it's at night, you know, it wasn't a really tall hotel, but it was one of the higher structures. And I could see the battles. I could hear the mortars. I could see them fire them. I could see them go off. I could, you know, and so on. And I thought to myself, this must be what it was like for the colonists on Bunker Hill, you know, or Breed's Hill as it actually was. Sitting there, I mean, how surreal can this be? That you're in the middle of this war and you're in it, but you're not in it. You know, it was a very bizarre time. So, yes.
I'd like to address a point about how we lost the war when we were winning. In 72 and 73, we were actually winning wholeheartedly. And we were trying to develop the ARVN, the Army of South Vietnam, to become independent. And Lam Son 719 was an incursion into Laos and Cambodia, where the ARVN went into so that they could say that they could defend their country. And they went all the way to North Vietnam. I was flying air cover there at that time. And then the word was coming back to the South Vietnam press why unite under the North? Why can't we unite under the South? And they wanted to attack the North. And if we were in that situation, we were afraid that if they went into the North, Russia would get involved. So how do we get the ARVN to withdraw out of the trail and back to South Vietnam? Well, somebody made the decision to come in as they were gathering to attack the North, to pick up the American advisors. And they were the ones in contact with the air support. They felt abandoned. So they withdrew along the trail, leaving the equipment, and the press had a field day showing the ARVN retreating as if in defeat. That lost the war.
Well, I probably agree with you that that's an important thing to consider, but I think there's another piece here that's very important. We're now in the era of Kissinger and Nixon. And in that administration, their view of the world was, Kissinger's in particular, and he was very explicit about this, everything had to be done to try and simultaneously defeat the Soviet Union if possible, mitigate against its doing anything that could be harmful to us, was the second part of that priority. Everything else was secondary. And so Vietnam, or conflicts going on in Latin America, or any in the Middle East, all of those things were considered to be secondary and tertiary in relationship to it. And Vietnam became simply something to settle and give up on. We didn't care about winning in Vietnam. The idea was declare victory, pretend it happened, and go home so that you could do the other things you were doing with the Soviet Union. So those were convenient ways in which they played a lot of the game, and some of that journalism was probably help being written out of the White House in dark intelligence. And we did a lot of dark intelligence because I saw a lot of it. So, it's
Well,
time.
our time has arrived to end, and would you be able to stay for a few minutes if other people wanted to come up and talk with you?
Sure.
I want to thank all y'all for being here. I say this all the time, but if you've never signed our sign-in sheet over there, we'd appreciate having your name and an email address so that we can keep you up to date on things going on. That's particularly important right now because next week is our last scheduled Noon Debrief, because on June 3rd, the museum's going to be shutting down for 4 months because of this. It's related to this construction that you've got going on in this building. You can see all this stuff going out in the parking lot and everything. And it's going to be extremely difficult. You'd have to go around through a plywood tunnel or something to get in here. And so Alan Robertson, the executive director, has decided this is a very good time to do some things that the museum needs to do. Got 7,000 artifacts that need to be stored better than they are, more securely and more environmentally protected. During that time, people can still come into the museum if they come in a small group with an appointment to do so, but it's not going to be generally open to the public. And because of the work being done, not only outside, but there's going to be work in that just gallery across the hall. This room is not going to be available, and it might not be available for some time after the museum reopens because there's so much going on over here. So we are working on plans right now to try to have some off-site Noon Debriefs. And we've tentatively got one planned, although we don't have a place for it yet. It might be at Richland Library or Lexington Library. And that'll be on June 28th. But we're still putting that together. But that's what's going on. We might have 2 during the summer. In the past, we've often had these interrupted because so many people are out of town and everything. We hope to have another one in August, and after that we're figuring it out. So it's important, if you like to come to these, that we'd be able to get a hold of you and let you know what's going on. I want to thank you again for being here, and thank you, Moss.